Walthamstow, Tower Hamlets, Brighton, everywhere else. We've had young, old, black, white, Asian, straight and gay, women and men. That's the strength of our movement, and we all have to be, both on the TUC demonstration against austerity on the 20th, and we have to be in Walthamstow on the 27th, because I believe if we stop them again, we'll break the back of the EDL for once and good, and that's the prize for us.
We have in Europe a massive problem with the far right. And Europe is a really big place, and 6 minutes is a really little amount of time. So it's going to be really difficult to give you a sense of the vastness of the problem that we face. But we don't only face a problem with the far right, we face a problem with the far right because of the fertile terrain. That was mentioned earlier, the fertile terrain that we have now. We can't be at war for over 11 years without creating enemy images about Muslims and feeding Islamophobia. So we can't be at war without giving the fodder for the far right. So my point is that actually the war against terror and the war against refugees and migrants are in many ways what is feeding the growth of the far right. And I think nationalism today is actually the breeding ground for fascism. So that's my first point. My second point is that the threat that we are facing is very diverse. It's not the same as what we were facing in the 1980s. I might look terribly sort of, it sounds very respectable that I'm from the Institute of Race Relations, but I do actually, in a previous life, I was treasurer of the Anti-Fascist Action in the 1980s. At that time, we were concerned about the BNP were just coming up that time, and all our energies were taken into countering the growth of the BNP in this country. But if you look at Europe as a whole, we have a number of problems. We have the electoral extreme right in Eastern Europe, focusing very much on the Roma, and I know that we'll hear more about what's happening in Hungary with Jobbik, which is one of our greatest threats. I would say one of the two greatest threats in Europe at the moment. The other is Golden Dawn in Greece, which is a neo-Nazi organisation which has many members in the parliament. I think it's, I don't know if anyone knows the exact figure, I think it's 13 actually. 18. And I mean, what's happening in Greece today in the terms of their black shirts, they're going around making absolutely no bones about the fact that they're into violence, and they don't give a damn. So, people like the Danish People's Party in Denmark started out as an anti-immigration movement, and then, because of Islamophobia, turned into an anti-Islam, anti-Muslim movement. And obviously, many of these parties are actually the kingmakers in coalition governments. Where you have coalition governments, these parties have a lot more power, because as we saw in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders brought down the last government. So you have that on the one hand. You also have a rise in right-wing populism, which is the classic example is in Switzerland, Swiss People's Party, who in many ways they come from a conservative tradition, but they're no different from the extreme right. If you see their electoral posters, they had one poster one year which was, kick the black sheep out of Switzerland. So you have that. But at the moment, what we're seeing is a resurgence of the classical neo-Nazi street fighting forces, with many paramilitary organisations as well, as in Hungary, where you have the Outlaws Army, you have paramilitary squads joining with the Civic Guard for the Better Future, which is linked to Jobbik, which are carrying out the most intense and horrible activities in Roma neighbourhoods. They're marching through the areas, sometimes with whips and weapons, and they're just, they're doing things like going into Roma homes and inspecting how clean. I hope they can't come around my house, especially not this morning. And I'm of Hungarian origin, so they may think that I've gone over to the other side. But, so this is one problem. Within the neo-Nazi movement, you also have what's called the autonomous nationalists, the national anarchists, not to be confused with anarchists. And they're like, they're like a street fighting force, but they're very seductive because they're anti-globalisation and they're anti-state. The third point is, don't please be mistaken to think that this is a movement. These are movements of poor people, working class people who, as the media like to say now, we have to understand the EDL and the BNP because of immigration and all this stuff, and it's a protest vote amongst people who have lost out. These movements have very, very powerful supporters. There's a lot of money being ploughed into these organisations, and there's a pseudo-intellectual movement. I forgot to mention the most important thing in my little history of who everyone is. It's called the counter-jihadi movement. And the counter-jihadi movement, as we're seeing at the moment with this, this whole video that's gone round insulting the prophets, they're a very diverse movement. They include people like EDL, the ultra-patriots, the identity movements around Europe, but they also include Christian fundamentalists, also what I would call ultra-secularists or secularist fundamentalists, including a certain strain within feminism, right-wing feminism and identity politics feminism. So they've got a lot of money behind them, and they've got a lot of supporters, and they've got a lot of people who are sort of pseudo-intellectuals who people take seriously, the people who are behind this whole myth of Eurasia. The threat that we face now is more intense because there's state collusion with the growth of the far right. This is the most important point. What is happening in Germany at the moment, everyone keep an eye into the parliamentary investigation into the National Socialist Underground, which carried out 10 murders from 2000-2007, mostly of German Turks. The state tried to ban the National Democratic Party of Germany, which is a neo-Nazi party, which the NSU had links with in 2002. But the Supreme Court rejected that on the grounds that the German intelligence services had so many informers within the NPD that they were effectively running it. There's state collusion within informer systems, within intelligence services and the police with the growth of the far right. They're letting it grow. In this country, collusion is an elastic term. It can encompass a lot of things, as we saw in Northern Ireland, because this is how my understanding of this came, where there was state collusion with loyalist paramilitaries. And they're following the same model in the UK with the EDL. They see the EDL as a public order problem, equal with an anti-fascist problem on one hand and a fascist problem on the other hand. The model they're using is that you lot are like the Republicans, you're like the IRA. You need the hard anti-terrorist approach. The other lot, the EDL, the ultra-patriots, are like the loyalists. There's a policing problem. And what we're seeing again in Germany, I will finish here, is that the anti-racist movement in Germany are being hit on the head massively. Right? If you're an anti-racist organisation, you have to sign a declaration pledging to follow the government's state definition of extremism, which means you can't work with any Muslim organisations in the country. You can't go and defend the mosque, because if you do, you're working with Muslim fundamentalists. And finally, in Lower Saxony, the Green Party, the main political parties, have joined a campaign because the police in Lower Saxony have said that they're going to use drones for the surveillance of anti-fascist protests. So that's my final point, the most important. Sorry, I apologise for going over time.
In Hungary, in April 2010, a coalition of the Fidesz party who are campaigning on a sort of ultra-nationalist ticket together with the Christian Democrats won a two-third majority in the parliament, and the openly fascist Jobbik party got 17%, forming the so-called opposition. The former the Socialist Party, who was in government before, and a few social democratic and liberal small parties are now in a tiny minority in Hungarian government. So within the last 2 years of government, the ethno-nationalist party led by Viktor Orban has been rapidly demolishing all the democratic structures of the country. Silencing of the media, disempowerment of the judiciary, and installment of right-wing to right extremists in all leading positions across the institution. For example, the director of Budapest Theatre was replaced with a Jobbik man. With a two-third majority, they have been putting through a flood of new laws, 213 in 1 year, to cement their power. Amongst that, for example, are the media laws. There's a gremium of Fidesz, of Fidesz people sort of judging whether a radio station, a television station, a newspaper is reporting balance. And if they are not, in their view, doing balanced reporting, they can be absolutely fined out of business. It's an effective, complete silencing of all independent media. Officially, the Fidesz party and the openly fascist Jobbik party are not working together officially. But in actual fact, Orban has used the Jobbik party in order to get into power, and they are sharing about 60% of their ideology. The ideology of the Fidesz party is based on an ethnic national identity, and everybody who doesn't fit into this identity, mainly Roma and Jews, and anybody who is disagreeing with the government is called Jew, are getting criminalized and dehumanized in very, very severe ways. The paramilitary arm of Jobbik, they are changing their names, and there's lots of organizations out there. It was originally the Hungarian Guard. They got outlawed in 2008. They were the ones marching during the election campaigns with open Hitler salute and shouting at the mayor of Budapest that he should go to the concentration camp. They were officially outlawed, but just reformed themselves a month later as the new Hungarian Guard, and there's a whole raft of paramilitary Nazi outfits, particularly notoriously in Karpata, a small village north of Budapest. They were staging a training camp, and then for several months terrorizing and the Roma population, issuing death threats. And I stayed there with the Roma community later last year in summer, and the children told me they are not sleeping anymore because the Nazis are coming with guns on a regular basis. The Jobbik mayor installed a crop police to protect the crops, and this crop police is made up of former Hungarian Guard members, the ones who have been terrorizing the Roma in the village, and they are armed with Land Rover and guns. Many of the Roma population in Karpata have lived there for about 500 years, and now everybody who can is trying to immigrate. Last February, the House of Janos Karpakas, with my estate the summer before, got burned down when the whole family, well, basically when the Roma community were on an anti-fascist demonstration in Budapest. During that time, his house got burned down. Running out of time. Basically, a Roma driver was stopped and all his papers were taken away without any reason. When someone from his family asked, why are you taking his family, his papers away, altogether the Roma were attacked with CS gas, and then the driver, the relative and his mother were taken away to a police station, very badly beaten up, and they were then taken to hospital to get patched up. But they tried to get a medical report, they refused the medical report, and then afterwards they had to sign, they were forced to sign that they hadn't been assaulted, and then they were fined €200 each, which is the equivalent of a month's wages for assaulting the police. Just 3 days ago, the police broke into the house of one of the Roma leaders, completely demolished everything that was in the house, and they took his 19-year-old son, and they were beating him to a pulp. So that is basically what is happening in Hungary at the moment.
I just wanted to have a look at where we are currently in this country, and particularly in the light of recent election failures for the BNP. Because what I think we're seeing is a fragmentation of some of the BNP's, if you like, active support, which seems to have run off into a number of different directions. First of all, as a group, gone back to the National Front, which I think is symbolic actually, because if you remember John Tyndall's words in the 1970s, the National Front actually, for whatever they're trying to dress itself up, actually, Tyndall said that the National Front was a pro-white party. And there's a number of people from the BNP have gone back to that because they're not finding that message, if you like, gaining any success at the ballot box recently through the BNP. A number have joined the EDL, for obvious reasons, we'll come on to that in a minute. A number have joined the English Democrats, who had a guy elected as the Mayor of Doncaster in 2009 on a clear anti-immigration policy. And what worrying, I think, is the tie-up between the British Freedom Party and English and the EDL, whose press statement said, and I quote, there are endless possibilities between a grassroots social movement, the EDL, working in tandem with a political party, the British Freedom Party, to the extent that the leader of the EDL is trying to announce the immigration policy with Northern was Irish, and one of the two different names, I'm not sure what that is. You know, they're trying to move forward, if you like, both the street fighting machine and if you like, a political machine, which I think we need to be aware of. And because they find success, where they find success at the ballot box, in my view, is on this issue of immigration. And you know, there's no wonder there's a distorted view on immigration. We, you know, about the way the press portrayed different things on different issues. You know, a lot of the way the press has portrayed for 23 years. And the demonisation of Liverpool fans and inclusion of a number of police over that. So the press have put forward a distorted view on immigration. It seems to me to go down to two issues. And immigrants, yeah, are either illegals, yeah, i.e. shouldn't be here, or asylum seekers. Either way, they end up surrounding off the welfare state. Despite the fact that of all the immigrants that come to this country, it's a very, very small percentage of people who would fall into those categories, even those categories were, if you like, legitimate categories for us to discuss. And the way it runs for me is, of course, fueled by the popular press in terms of that anti-immigration view. You know, anti-immigration becomes anti-multiculturalism, anti-multiculturalism in itself becomes anti-white, and we're pro-white. That's how I see a quick run-through of the direction, if you like, that they take. And two academics, Goodwin and Ford, did a bit of research. I found out that 45% of BNP supporters, when questioned, said that they actually supported the view of what's known as biological racism, i.e., that white people are intellectually superior to people who are non-white. And that's the real reason. It's the real reason people join the BNP and branch out into fascist parties in this country. So racism becomes, if you like, a fear of alien culture in this country, then that's translated as a fear of a non-white culture, and make this country non-white. And I always say to people who you're able to have the discussion with, who're still open to persuasion. I was born a white male in this country. I'm now in my 50s. So David Cameron. I have absolutely nothing in common with David Cameron. But I was born as a working class lad in Liverpool, right? And grew up as a working class lad in Liverpool, as did Anthony Walker. And Anthony Walker was a black lad who was murdered on the streets of Liverpool. I have more in common with Anthony Walker than I do with David Cameron. So it's not about the colour of your skin, to me. It's about who you have your identity with. I don't think culture naturally comes from, well, just because you're white, you were born in England. My ancestors are Irish. Just because you were white, you were born in England. Somehow you have this British culture, and everybody else has a different culture. I just don't get that. So coming from the trade union point of view, I just want to make the point that trade unionists, I just want to quote one specific example. In the mid-80s, Ford, not in Dagenham, which is significant because of the electoral success of the BNP had in Dagenham, where workers took actual action. We had a foreman employed by Ford in Dagenham. His name was Tony Lakener. I think he was a convicted bomber. He used to be a national front. So he was actually as a foreman and an outrageous leaflets in the workplace. And it took the trade unions to form then an Equal Opportunities Committee, which culminated in putting ads in the local black press for black people to come and work in Fords in Dagenham. So, direct action by trade unions on the ground, beginning to combat the views of racists in that particular workplace. So as I said before, this issue about culture, and I think there are divisions in society, and if you want, you can stand back and go, the divisions are on race, on colour, on religion, or for me actually, the divisions are on wealth. Right? And there's an inbuilt interest in those who have wealth in society to put divisions amongst the rest of us. And talking in terms of the BNP, we've seen a slight collapse in their vote. I don't think there's a need to understate it, and I don't think there's a need to overstate it. The BNP, I think, has kept its hardcore support for the ballot box. I think what happened in various elections in recent times, actually we saw a complete collapse in the Labour vote, and not a massive upsurge in the vote for the BNP in certain areas. And one of the questions I had at the time was, where is the rest of the mainstream parties? And I think what happened to the ballot box was that the mainstream parties, the Tory, the Liberal Democrats and Labour, were providing no alternative to the thing that divide us in society. So there is fair target now, particularly around the economy, that are going to push divisions, because the way I understand it, the tax on the NHS is going to be a scarcity of health resources, tax on education, working class children will be more poorly educated, there's going to be less jobs in society and less well-paid jobs, and there's going to be an attack on the welfare state, and that creates a mindset that there's insufficient to go around, there's insufficient of whatever it is to go around. And naturally, when there's insufficient to go around, people say, someone else is getting your shit. Someone else is getting what you should have got. And it's easy to say that the people who are getting what you should have got are different from you because they look different from you. Yeah? And they're different from you because they practice a different religion and the state recognises in this society. And they're the divisions that we need to look at. And the real division is the division between the people who own the wealth and the people who are exploiting those down the other end of the scale, which is predominantly working class people. I mentioned the book about anti-fascism. I just wanted to talk about the second book that I've read. First book I've read for quite some time by Robert Paxton. It's called The Anatomy of Fascism. And what he says in identifying fascism is it's a mistake to identify fascism historically through high-profile events. So big incidents like Kirsten active job, which are horrific, but it's wrong to do it. What he said is, for fascism to work on the ground, ordinary people make it happen. Yeah? Now, the main fascist opposition I see to a multicultural society in this country happens to be the BNP and latterly the EDL. The EDL was set up by a city banker and a major property developer. It was set up by working class people, and it was set up by the money elements of society. And what the point is made in this book is actually it's ordinary people make it happen on the ground for fascists. And my view is that it's ordinary people can stop it. And that's the message that I take in terms of the trade union movement, because we carry the motion at the TUC this week that I spoke on supporting in the PFA, that the TUC needs to get its arse in gear, for want of a better phrase, and start to talk to those groups, one society, one culture, united against fascism. Because the stuff about Germany, and the stuff about it being illegal to talk to like Muslim communities, I think is where if you like, the combined left has failed in fighting fascism on the continent is it's allowed to alienate itself from the Muslim community. Which really United Against Fascism and other groups in this country have done is talk to the Muslim community on where it belongs, which is why when the EDL came up, it's communities who are coming forward, not political groups, but communities, the societies, saying we don't want this type of racism and fascism on our streets. So as the book said, and I'll make this point, it's ordinary people that make fascism happen on the street in terms of the street fighting machine, and it's ordinary people coming together, regardless of religion or colour, that will stop it.
2 years ago, at Christmas, I was invited to speak at a conference called World Against Nazism in Moscow. At that conference, that night, the groups of football hooligans and fascists were going to take to the streets. So I thought I'd wander down and have a look at the railway station and see what it was like. I was slightly surprised, there were 7,000 of them, and they were carrying swords, brickbats, big staves of wood. And that night they went on a rampage. They stabbed 73 people, all migrants, people with different colour skin, people they thought were Jews, and they killed 3 people. That got just one paragraph in The Guardian, and I didn't see it reported anywhere else in Britain. It was the most horrific thing I've ever seen in my life, and for me it began an interest in looking at what was going on, particularly across Eastern Europe, but in the rest of Europe as well. And I want to agree very much with Liz, and I want to argue that I think fascism is developing in 3 ways in Europe. Of course there's differences in each country, it's impossible in this time to go through it, but it's developing in 3 particular paths, along 3 tracks. The first, I'd argue, is the far-right populism of people like UKIP, Pim Fortuyn's, and people like that, the Freedom Party in Austria, organisations which claim to be politically respectable but carry out a very deeply racist agenda. The second form I'd argue it's taken is the form of organisations like the British National Party and the Front National, a kind of Euro-fascist strategy, which really is to pretend that you're not fascists, to cloak yourself in respectability, stand in elections and make electoral breakthroughs, at the same time maintaining underneath the surface your fascist organisation to the core. This has been an important development because I think it's thrown many of the left around, because they think unless fascists was walking around with jackboots on, carrying swastikas, then it can't be a fascist. That's never been the case. That's not even true of Hitler, by the way. I think he always walked around in a Nazi uniform. When he spoke to businesses, he wore a suit. When he went to meet farmers, he wore stupid lederhosen. When he went to meet workers, he wore boiler suits. Fascism comes in many different ways. It don't just come at you in it. The third, and I think is a dangerous trend we're seeing, is a kind of street fighting element that's beginning to develop in England, obviously the English Defence League, but you see real vicious elements of this developing in many European countries. Organisations that are overtly fascist and make no bones about it and are encouraging young hooligan elements, right-wing elements to join them and get involved. Of course, and this is the dangerous bit, is I believe there's a serious cross-fertilisation taking place between those organisations, which means because none of them are making a complete breakthrough, they keep looking to each other to see what elements they can draw off from that. That's why the Dutch fascists look, or right-wing populists look to the EDL. That's why the EDL looks to the right in America, to Jobbik in Hungary. That's why the leader Alan Lake of the EDL, the man who finances it in my opinion, seems to be promoting websites for all the far-right parties across Europe, whatever, Swedish Democrat, Jobbik, and the Dutch, and also the English EDL. So you can see how they do this. And that makes the situation potently very dangerous indeed, I'd argue. The second point I want to make is the factors that are enabling these organisations to grow. And the first, and I think probably the most important for us, is the economic crisis. Because this economic crisis is ripping the heart out of Europe. It's absolutely destroying communities, it's throwing people on the dole, and it's creating huge levels of bitterness. And it doesn't take a genius to work out that fascism has always grown out of periods of profound economic crisis. It's how it developed in the 30s. I'd argue you saw the beginnings of it develop in Britain in the late 70s for exactly the same reasons. And I think it's worth saying this, that it's more deeper in Eastern Europe. And I'd argue it for a simple reason, because when I was in Russia, you talk to lots of young Russian kids, and what would they say to you? Well, we've tried communism. I know for SWP members in here, state capitalism, right? We tried communism stroke state capitalism. That failed. We've had market capitalism. That's failed. There must be a third solution. And that's a very widespread, common discussion you have with young people in Eastern Europe. In other words, they believe that their leaders have failed, and therefore, not only is their crisis more profound, the other alternatives have been destroyed rapidly. And I'd also make the point, even in mainstream Europe, in Central Europe and Northern Europe, the failure of the social democratic parties to really give hope to people has seen fascist growth on the back of it. It's absolutely a fact that the Front National grew out of the failure of the Socialist Party in France. The BNP's rise came out of the Labour failure of the Labour government. It didn't come out of the Tories, it actually came out after Blair was in office. The second, and I think again this is very, very serious, is the growth of certain forms of racism. Islamophobia, certainly in America and in Northern Europe, is very, very deep indeed. In fact, I would argue it's as bad as any form of anti-Semitism we saw in the 1930s. Just the sheer volume of attacks against Muslim people, the idea you can say anything you like about Muslim people, it's totally acceptable, is very, 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 very pernicious indeed. And it doesn't just come from the street, as some people try and make out. It comes from the mainstream media. It comes from the political classes as well, right across the spectrum. I would argue. Thirdly, this seems to me to be impacting on older forms of racism. So we're seeing anti-Roman racism across Eastern Europe and France and Italy. We are seeing the rise, I would argue, of anti-Semitism now, again, back to old forms. And some forms of black racism seem to come out of it, as well as certain things. You only have to look at English football to see some of that stuff beginning to come back. Thirdly is migration and the fear of migration, which is, I think, tied in with the economic crisis. That's all I need. And lastly, I think we're beginning to see, and this is important, is ruling classes across Europe openly playing the race card. Openly playing the race card. It wasn't just David Cameron that attacked multiculturalism, but Sarkozy and Merkel have done exactly the same thing in France and Germany, respectively. So what do we think? And this is my last point. You see, I was very proud. I don't know anyone who said Wolf of Forest a couple of seconds ago, but you should pat yourselves on the back because you delivered a hammer blow to the English defence team. And actually, before you even finished your protest, I was on the radio, and the first question I was asked was, is Britain different from the rest of Europe? And in some ways, it could look different. Because actually, the British National Party is in disarray, and on 2 Saturdays ago, the English Defence League looked like it was crumbling. But for me, is it a question of objective conditions or subjective conditions? You see, I would make the argument, with the exception of Greece, that Britain has many of the same indices as the rest of Europe. The crisis in Britain is similar to the crisis in Holland, France, Spain, Italy, and the rest. It's not as deep, clearly, as Greece and Eastern Europe, but nonetheless it's deep. Levels of migration to Britain are no different than they are into France. It's not true that the British ruling class is more happy to welcome people of different colour and different workers, and they're just as bloody vicious as their European counterparts. I don't really believe the objective conditions for the growth of fascism is true. Actually, only 2 years ago, the BNP won 2 million votes. 50, 60 councillors, 2 MEPs, member of the GLA. Think about it, they were making significant breakthroughs. The subjective difference is this. We have an organisation that wherever they march, challenges them, tackles them, fights them on the street, politically in our meetings, in our unions, in our schools, in our colleges, in our education, in our concert venues, that goes and takes the argument on and labels them fascists, labels them Nazis. It's a disaster in France to give Le Pen the credence he's not a fascist. It's a disaster not combating Golden Dawn in Greece. It's something the Greek left have to do urgently. I was in Hungary only 2 years ago at a concert, the very first concert put on anti-fascism in Zizet in Hungary, in Budapest. Down the road, 10,000 Nazis had their own racist festival, and the organisers did not want to go and stop their festival taking place. If we do not combat the rise of the far right, it will come back, and it will be just like the 1930s. It will grow bigger and bigger, and the problem we have now in a number of European countries is it's so big, the scale of the opposition to it is not matching it. So in France, in May Day, 10,000 Front National members marched through the streets of Paris unopposed. I'm glad that we fight from here. I'm glad that we stopped with Walthamstow, in Tower, it's just down the road from here, in Bristol, in Brighton, in Cambridge, in Newcastle, in Scotland, in Dundee, Glasgow and Edinburgh, because if we don't, we will pay the greatest price, and that will be a repeat of the 1930s. So the lesson for me is, this is a dangerous development, but we need a serious anti-racist, anti-fascist organisation to take them on and challenge them, because if we don't, we will pay the ultimate price, every single one of us.
Yeah.
Hungary today is a scary example of what happens if fascist ideology and ultranationalist ideology and organizations are not opposed and are allowed to grow.
When the ban on full-face veil coverings was brought in France, there was only one MP who actually opposed the bill. Communist Party, Green Party abstained, most of them. There was one MP in the whole of France. In this country, yes, what Martin has said is true, that the left have been better about coming out to challenge Islamophobia on the streets. But I think that there's a lot more to be done in terms of the left challenging the institutionalised racism in the criminal justice system.
What made about politicians playing the race card, I think is absolutely right. If you just look at some examples, 2008, William Hague made immigration an issue, said they were going to make immigration an issue, and the BNP debate to stop. 2002, the look and said that asylum seekers were, and I quote, swamping Britain, immediately followed by a breakthrough for BNP in Burnley. When Gordon Brown talks about British jobs for British workers, that was replicated by the BNP in their literature. And more importantly, when Cameron decried multiculturalism in this country, and did it about 4 blocks down from it, in there and the streets, significantly, the EDL said, at last a mainstream politician who was talking about language. And so, you know, I'm sick and tired of politicians pandering to racism and not dealing with the problem. Because I'll say it again, the problem is an economic problem and, if you like, an economic crisis. So, you know, instead of, you know, there's not enough houses to go around and it's your, you know, it's someone else's fault, there's not enough jobs to go around. But then why don't we build more council houses and why don't we create more jobs? This is even worrying. It's even more worrying, because if you talk to particularly PCS who are on the CQ in the audience, you know, they're being told by governments, we've only had something like 15% of the cuts that are going to come. If there's another 85% of cuts on there, where things are bad now, what they said are going to waste, and when cuts will not work, which they won't, they're going to have to single out people, groups of people, right, to be discriminated against, right? And that's where, if you like, state racism and state discrimination will come in.
I just want to assure you there's one thing, I'm not complacent at all about state racism. I think if you look on the posters that are up there, we are always campaigning against police racism, against the racism of the government. That's why we launched the Defend Multiculturalism book. That's why we are absolutely clear. And I think it's vital. You can't just deal with the rats. That's what I call the fascists. They're the ones, it's the sewer that's the problem. You have to, if you don't, the rats come out of the sewer. Unless you deal with the sewer and disrupt the sewer, they're going to keep coming out of the sewer all the time. That's, I think you have to have a social strategy to a policy as well as just combating the far right on the streets. I don't believe that's the only way forward. Secondly, is this. I just want to say something else, which is we have to have an independent anti-fascist movement across Europe. I'll tell you what I get really depressed about, and I do think it's an urgent task. When I was at the Schmidt Festival, when I arrived there, a deputation of Roma refugees come and met me and said that at a town called Mayur, the Roma families were smashed up and attacked, and the pregnant woman was dragged out of her house and beaten up. The festival we organised there, the Rock Against Racism Festival we organised there, was a bit like Glastonbury. And I ended up sitting on a stupid plastic toadstool on live TV talking about the problem. And I mentioned this Roma family being attacked. I was then immediately taken out of the studio, told out to meet the English ambassador, met the organiser of the festival. It was told I was not allowed to mention this because it was a lie, it never happened, and if I was to carry on, they were going to shut the festival down. Now, two things I wanted to ask them was, one, what the hell has it got to do with the English ambassador about an anti-fascist festival? And you have to watch this in the studio because they're trying to they want to influence the political dynamic. But secondly, I don't like being called a liar. So I went to the village and found that there was an attack, that down the road there was a Nazi festival, and that the Roma were attacked there. I got a priest to do a signed statement, and we got two of the Roma people to come. I was then told that the embassy had made a massive mistake. It may well have happened. And I was then told that we weren't allowed to mention this on the festival stage. You see, for me, it's very, very important that we have independent anti-fascists from any government bodies or anything like that, because actually you can't trust them. Because part of the problem we've got are these people creating the backgrounds to the rise and the far right. It's their racism. And in some ways it's worse, actually, I think. David Cameron's attack on multicultural is worse than some thug in the EDL. Because David Cameron is consciously trying to use racism. And this, unlike the scumbag from the EDL, who probably don't know any better. When you have someone openly playing the race card, it seems to be more pernicious and nasty than anything else you can imagine. The second prerequisite of the anti-fascist movement, I believe, we have to fight for across Europe, is the idea of a united front. That we have to begin to win the idea. You may disagree with each other on a whole number of things. You may be a Labour Party member, a black nationalist, an anarchist, a socialist, a Trotskyist, whatever you may well be. The truth of it is we have to have our disagreements, I accept all that, but when it comes to combating fascism and racism, we have to unite together. Because if we don't, it will come through the middle. And that seems to me to be the lesson we have to win all over. We have to win it in England, we have to win it in Scotland, we have to win it across Europe, because if we don't, we will beat Germany in the 1930s. I don't buy the argument that you can't, because someone's in the Labour Party, you shouldn't stand together if you're a Trotskyist. I don't buy it when it comes to this question, because when the EDL took power, they wouldn't discriminate. They're not interested in different various forms of left-wing politics. They blame all of us. And so for me, when it comes to things like Walthamstow, I was proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with a Labour MP. I was proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with this local synagogue, because I tell you what, if we don't, we're going to reduce our numbers, and sadly, across Europe, there are really very deep political differences with the anti-fascist movements, and they don't work with each other. I think it's a big mistake. That has happened in Britain as well. We have to avoid that at all costs, and that's why I'm involved with Unite Against Fascism. That's why I'm an absolute believer that on the question of one issue, on the question of fascism, we have to come together and fight together, because that's when we're strongest. When we're united, we can defeat them, and when we're divided, they can defeat us.